All right, let's take a look at different cultural backgrounds. Quite a bit in this video. So we kind of range here from some cultural terminology to a few names you're gonna have to be familiar with, a couple of wars and segregation, and then move on to a few things about Renaissance, religion, and a little more on terminology. None of it really goes into great depth, but it is quite a bit to be familiar with. Okay, so here are some questions that we're going to be talking about. Cultural relativism, you know what that is? The Trail of Tears, a little familiarity with the Renaissance, um, what type of community has the greatest population density, intellectual leaders of the Hindu caste system, and then finally a series of religious wars by the Latin Church between the 11th and 15th centuries. Okay, so that's a lot. Let's get going. Okay, so we start with cultural terminology. So these 5 terms are really what you'll be tested on, and you just need to have really like a basic one sentence definition in your mind for each of them. So we'll go through each. Cultural diversity describes the variety of differences between cultural or ethnic groups. Okay, not surprising, pretty easy to guess that one. Ethnocentrism is demonstrated when one makes judgments about a culture that is different than their own. Cultural relativism is the principle that an individual's human beliefs and activities should be understood by others in terms of that individual's own culture. Okay. Cultural cohesion. This is the willingness of members of a society to cooperate with each other in order to survive and prosper. In order for this to happen, a common language is necessary. So that makes sense. The fact that the common language part that can show up as a question, and so you really want to be familiar with that for the cohesion. The rest of it is fairly easy to guess at. And then finally, forced diffusion is when one culture conquers or enslaves another and forces its own customs on others. Okay, so all 5 of those can easily show up as a question or as multiple parts of multiple choice answers. Okay, and then we have some names to be familiar with here. So we'll start with W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the first African American to receive a doctorate degree from Harvard and was one of the co-founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Okay, W.E.B. Du Bois, a very famous person in American history. Booker T. Washington, he was born a slave and became a civil rights leader and a prominent public speaker. Frederick Douglass was an African American social reformer, abolitionist, speaker, and writer. And then Hitler and Mussolini were both fascist. Hitler was a Nazi, but Mussolini was the leader of the Italian National Fascist Party. Okay, so if you're kind of thinking in terms of questions, it's possible they're like, so W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Frederick Douglass all have really some similar characteristics, in that they were all, civil rights leaders. They're all African American. Du Bois definitely has the parts about first doctorate degree from Harvard, as well as being the co-founder of the NAACP. So a little more worthwhile, perhaps, to get those facts in your mind. And then Hitler and Mussolini are obviously very different. So, if you said which one of these was not a civil rights leader in the United States, and Hitler or Mussolini was an example along with those 3, that's probably too easy of a question. But regardless, and then we also have Mao Zedong. Need to be familiar with him. He was the founding father of the People's Republic of China, but not the Communist Party of China. He ruled with an autocratic style from the formation of the People's Republic of China in 1949 until he died in 1976. Mao became an advocate of the socio-political theory of Marxism. Mao is one of the most controversial figures in history, credited with driving imperialism out of China while modernizing the country and improving education. He was also a dictator responsible for millions of civil rights abuses and deaths. So Mao Zedong is a big name in history, and I would expect him to show up somewhere on the test. He shows up in more than one section, in more than one video for us, and he's just a big name in history. And like we said, he is a controversial figure who did many great things for the Republic of China and some horrible things too. All right. So war and segregation. Trail of Tears. I believe that was one of our questions. The Trail of Tears was a series of forced relocations of Indian nations following the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Battle of Tippecanoe was fought in 1811 and involved U.S. expansion, but it was a one-day battle. The Sand Creek Massacre occurred during the American Indian Wars in 1864 and led to the death of over 150 Native Americans in the Colorado Territory. Okay, so there we have 3 Native American wars, and we want to be familiar with all of them. The Trail of Tears is the most commonly asked question, but within the answer choices will be the description of the Sand Creek Massacre, for example. So we want to know the difference between those. Apartheid was a system of national segregation in South Africa enforced through legislation from 1948 to 1994. In 1994, there were multi-race democratic elections won by Nelson Mandela. That could easily have been under the name thing, right? Knowing apartheid and Nelson Mandela, definitely a name that could easily show up. And then finally, the Crusades were a series of religious wars by the Latin Church that took place between the 11th and 15th centuries. Okay, so if you know that, that's enough to know about the Crusades. And I believe that was a question too, if we go back to the questions. Yeah, the very last one. Series of religious wars by the Latin Church between the 11th and 15th centuries are known as the Crusades. Okay. Renaissance. Okay, so we had a question on this as well. Need to be familiar with the basics on the Renaissance. The Renaissance occurred between the 14th and 17th centuries and was a cultural movement that began in Italy. The influence of the Renaissance was felt in literature, philosophy, religion, science, art, and music. The intellectual basis of the Renaissance was humanism, and Machiavelli, as well as the art of Michelangelo and Leonardo, were among the influential people of this period. Okay, so I would know those names if it was up to me. If you could only know one thing about the Renaissance, though, it wouldn't even be the time period or the fact that it began in Italy, or even the impact on literature, philosophy, religion, science, art, music. It would be that the intellectual basis was humanism, right? That is the most likely question to show up, but really just having, a nice few sentences in your mind about the Renaissance, and you should be good to go. Okay, in terms of religion, the Torah is the central reference in the Judaic religion. You need to know that. Traditional Hindus have a fairly rigid caste system in which individuals are born into castes that entail certain types of work for their lives. And the Brahmins are the spiritual and intellectual leaders of the Hindu caste system. I believe that was a question as well. Am I wrong? Sometimes I just dream these things up. There you go. Second to last bullet point. Who are the intellectual leaders of the Hindu caste system? Right? The Brahmins. Right? We want to be familiar with that. Okay. Community classification. Okay, so being able to differentiate rural, suburb, exurban, and urban. So, right, real basically, rural communities are all territory outside of urbanized areas. Suburbs are a district directly outside of the city. Exurbans are prosperous communities. Urban communities have the most population density, right? If you only could keep one thing in your mind on that one, urban communities have the most population density. Population density can easily show up as a question. Okay, and then we got three more terms here. Let's show up. Glass ceiling is an invisible barrier that keeps a given demographic, which is usually women, from rising beyond a certain level in a hierarchy. The metaphor was first coined by feminists in reference to the barriers in the careers of high-achieving women. Negative reinforcement. This is a term described by B.F. Skinner in his theory of operant conditioning. In negative reinforcement, a response or behavior is strengthened by stopping, removing, or avoiding a negative outcome or aversive stimulus. On Monday morning, let's say you leave the house early, which would be the behavior, to avoid getting stuck in traffic and being late for class, which would be the removal of an aversive stimulus. That would be negative reinforcement. And then finally, we have gentrification, which results in property values increasing while lower income businesses and families are dispersed. Okay, so like I said, kind of goes all over the map on this one. So we don't need to know a lot of detail, but in general, we really do need to be familiar, like for example, the Trail of Tears, and can you say how that's different than the Sand Creek Massacre, right? They both happened in the 19th century. Anyway, at this point, it's best if you hit that pause button, see if you can answer all these questions. If you're confused about any of them, go back into the video, find the answer, and it will help you a lot for the exam.